Alright, sir. My name's John Harvey, and I'm a FATE here at Laughlin Air Force Base. Didn't make it to the Saturday, Sunday classes, but hoping my presentation will suffice for the class. I've given my presentation on the CRM issues with Korean Flights 007 that took off from Alaska back in 1983 and did not make it to its final destination of Seoul, Korea. Ended up transitioning some Soviet airspace and got shot down. We'll talk about some of the CRM issues that I found were involved between the pilots of the aircraft and the Soviets as well. So I can't figure out how to put the slides on the video as well, so I'll have the slides if you want to view them with me. I'll go through slide and kind of tell you what we're talking about. So slide 2 of my presentation, titled Korean Airlines Flight 007. We'll talk about the details of the flight, some of the issues that came about because of that. The CRM issues both on the aircraft side and the Soviet side, and some of the lessons learned from this that we have taken into account, and some that maybe we can in the future as well. So some flight details on slide 3. It was a Boeing 747 with 220 passengers. It originated that day from JFK, New York, and it flew to Anchorage and got there in the middle of the morning at 4 o'clock local time. 13Z, so it was a long flight there, and then the pilots had a long flight from Anchorage to Seoul. The big things that I noticed here was that some of the crew, obviously with that long a flight, is going to be switching with a hot crew, if you will, and they're going to be switching out, so you can find some fatigue issues with that spread of such a long flight all the way up to Anchorage, and I think that may have been one of the causal factors that I found CRM based. And we'll talk about the actual flight itself in slide 4, Korean Airlines 007 as well. There was an uneventful takeoff. They took off as normal. Got ATC vectors to the long route that was going to take them across the Pacific Ocean all the way to Seoul. ATC instructed them to turn heading of 220, and they were directed to intercept Air R-20 that would take you across Japanese airspace and avoid the Soviet airspace on the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then where they ended up getting shot down. It was a 50-mile buffer from anything that the INS navigation systems on the aircraft could have kept them away from that. So they were told to intercept that. ATC did their job. As we can imagine, there's not a lot of radar coverage along the Pacific Ocean. Not a lot of land-based radar out there. So they kind of go off of timing and go off. The ATC goes off of the timing and where these airplanes are, and really deconflicts aircraft based on the altitude they're flying at. So this aircraft was doing what they thought was correct. They flew that heading 220, and then at some point along the flight, we'll never know to this day exactly when it happened, that autopilot that they pressed heading mode on the autopilot to take them on that 220 heading, they failed to tell that autopilot to intercept that routing, that our route that would take them across the Pacific Ocean. So they had that heading mode on. They ended up flying that 220 heading up until the point that the aircraft was shot down. Next slide, slide 5. The pilots used the autopilot incorrectly, and they never intercepted that airway. In fact, they crossed right over it, headed directly towards Soviet airspace on the Kamchatka Peninsula, and they intercepted and flew out of international airspace to Soviet airspace to international airspace, and then back into Soviet airspace as they flew what the pilots thought was their final destination of Seoul. But in fact, they were hundreds and hundreds of miles off course, and that's why they ended up going into Soviet airspace. We'll move on to slide 6 now. We'll talk about the Soviet side and maybe why this happened. So this aircraft, this Boeing 747, flew from Alaska, which is near a lot of U.S. Air Force bases, and flew into Soviet airspace and then transitioned again into there. And truth be told, it was the Ronald Reagan presidency, so we were kind of badgering the Soviets at that point. We had a lot of RC-135s and spy planes that were there to soak up the electrons the Russians were putting out. And we had a lot, and they were flying right along the border of that international and Soviet airspace, so that they had always been tracking these aircraft on radar and watching them go through, and maybe just kind of lying in wait for one of our U.S. aircraft to actually enter that Soviet airspace, because they are international law. They're allowed to shoot down a military aircraft entering their airspace. So they had definitely been watching these aircraft to the teeth to make sure that they were doing the right thing and staying out of that Soviet airspace. Then on radar, for what they could see at the time, a Boeing 747 is going to look much like that RC-135 that's there with that radar picture. And with the high tensions of the Cold War, the Reagan administration badgering them, badgering the Soviets, they were at high alert to intercept anybody that went into airspace, and that's their sovereign territory, so they're allowed to do that. And also to kind of compound all this, there were radar problems that the Soviets were having at the time. 10 days prior to this incident, the radar had gone out due to some gales that had been hitting and demolishing that radar, for lack of a better term. So the radar operators and the command and control didn't really have all their resources available to them at the time. And as a result, they were a little bit on edge from that and looking to shoot down, not necessarily shoot down, but be on edge and intercept any rogue aircraft or any aircraft that may or may not be transitioning their airspace. Move on to the next slide, Soviet slide 7. And so basically what happened was this airliner transitioned the Kamchatka Peninsula, transitioned over the Soviet sovereign airspace, and as expected, the Soviets scrambled fighter aircraft towards that. And they scrambled there, and as they were being intercepted in international waters now, they were just kind of tagging along with that aircraft, if you will, flying formation with it to make sure that it did not continue that 220 heading that would take it into Soviet airspace, kind of towards the motherland, if you will. So these fighters were there from the Kamchatka Peninsula. The Soviets did not fire upon the aircraft at the first time they entered that airspace. Kind of held back a little bit to watch to see what this aircraft was doing. And they were there. The Flight 007 was in international waters, thought they were on their route, their airway, and they asked for a higher altitude to save some fuel on the way to Seoul. And the Tokyo Air Traffic Control at the time, who had no radar contact with them because they're so far out in the Pacific, granted them to climb. And as they climbed, they trade that excess airspeed they have for a little bit of altitude. And they climbed, they slowed down significantly, and the Soviet fighters were right on their tail. And they saw this significant climb occur, and they took that as evasive action. The pilots had no idea that Soviet fighters had intercepted them, saw this as evasive, and relayed that back to their Soviet command and control. Now the Soviets, seeing that this aircraft was on that 220 heading towards that Soviet airspace, did not want it to. They let it enter, but did not want it to transition for a long period of time into that Soviet airspace that would lead them into that Soviet mainland. Not sure what this aircraft was at the time. The fighters saw that it was a Korean Airlines 747. However, they assumed, because of the high tensions of the Cold War, that this aircraft was a spy plane. And rightfully so, based on kind of the tensions. We can all imagine what we were all going through back then. Maybe you were, sir. Back in '82 with the nuclear tensions. So command and control, with their limited situational awareness due to their radar outage, ordered that this aircraft be shot down over their sovereign airspace. And we'll talk, and the political implications and everything we're not really touching on in this presentation here, but it ended up being a really kind of big deal, if you will. A lot of tension occurred after this, that the Soviets had shot down an innocent, and the pilots did make some mistakes, but it was an innocent, not a spy plane transitioning Soviet airspace. So we're really going to focus on the CRM issue, so we'll move to the next slide. And on the Koreans Flight 007 side, the autopilot misinput, ATC lack of radar, lack of coverage, lack of communication, and the switching of the crews and the fatigue of the crews, and why that may have affected why this aircraft was able to be hundreds of miles, of course. We'll talk about the Soviet side, the command and control issues, how they felt threatened, and that false sense of urgency that was developed because they didn't really have a lot of SA over the entire situation. So move on to the next slide, slide 9. Title 007, we'll talk about the autopilot. And that's really what I want to focus on with my CRM, is that these pilots took off from Alaska. They were heading towards Seoul, and they got a vector from ATC. And they put the autopilot on the heading mode and failed to select the intercept mode on that 747. and they're tired. They've been flying for hours already. Had to do all the ground ops associated with that. I mean, it's a little button that's easy to miss. So maybe some human factors gets tied into this with the crew. How that autopilot back in the 80s, early 80s, may not have been the most human factors friendly system that's out there, but regardless, these pilots failed to notice the deviations that they had. A little bit of automation bias ties in. Automation bias being the tendency for humans, pilots, to trust the computers and not worry about it, because the computers, 99% of the time are giving you good information, the right information, but that 1% of the time they may be off, they may be a little bit wrong, and we tend not to question what the computer is outputting. So we don't tend to question what the autopilot does.